Tom, it's great to have you back. Uh, Today we're going to talk about GPT-4. How is it different from the previous generations, the plugins that has been just released, what it means for product builders, some areas of concerns if we have time. So let's dive right into it. And let's start with how GPT-4 is different from the previous generations. The reinforcement learning from human feedback was like a landmark feature of ChatGPT. What is that special about GPT-4?
Right. First of all, it's great to be back on the podcast. That was very fun last time. Let's dive in. So there are some huge differences between GPT-4 and GPT-3. There are also some things that have not changed almost at all, which was a surprise. So let me go through, and I've kind of categorized them into a couple different areas. First, GPT-4 is multimodal. This is a big deal. It can now accept images as a form of input, not just text. And also, I'll talk about this more through plugins. It can actually now accept any type of additional signal input, including just raw file uploads. This is a big deal because effectively, if you think of GPT-4 as a life form, previously all it could do was read, and now it can actually see. So we've given it eyes. In practice, what it means is the number of use cases is going to explode through the roof. You think about the way humans interact with the world. We are primarily, vision based. We like to observe things with our eyes, and so it makes sense that we want our AI to be able to do the same. Second big area is the input size. It's been increased from 4K, from 4,000 tokens up to as much as 32,000. So this is an 800% increase. Again, it's a big deal because now the AI model, can see 50 pages of text. So if you think of a human being that is not allowed to read more than 4 pages versus 50, it just, again, the number of use cases explodes with this change. So these are both very good investments that OpenAI had made. The third one, which I will talk about in more detail, is ChatGPT Plugins. I think this is a much bigger deal than people realize. As I mentioned, one of the things it does is it allows you to interact with ChatGPT through more than just text prompts. You can now upload files. You can connect it to like a Pandas notebook. You can connect it to IoT devices, to satellite images. And so I guess in a way, ChatGPT Plugins is allowing the model to start interacting with the entire physical universe around it. A huge deal. The next area is, where has ChatGPT-4 improved over ChatGPT-3? I think in some ways this is actually the more disappointing of the changes. There's a chart they published with their technical document, which shows, a graph of where the biggest improvements are. If you look at it, if you squint a bit, you realize that it's limited. They've had big improvements in LSAT scores, in statistics, physics, GRE, quantitative math, AP chemistry, the bar exam, calculus. What this tells me is I don't think they've changed the architecture of the model or the size or the training data very much. What they've done is collected new data sets specifically to address these areas. On the flip side, there's very little to no improvement on English lit, English language, GRE writing, world history, US government, psychology. So again, this makes me believe that OpenAI did not make a big investment in overall changing the architecture or the model size or the reinforcement learning mechanism. I think that's mostly remained the same. Some of the impressive things are ChatGPT-4 now in these specific science domains, it can now outperform a specialized model. So Google built PalmMed, which is a 540 billion parameter model, which was specialized to be the medical expert. And at the time of the release, about a month or two ago, it was by far the best performing in the various written and multiple choice medical exams. GPT-4 out of the box now does remarkably better than PalmMed. So this to me suggests that we are not going to see this big investment in very specialized large language models. More likely, we'll see a generalized language model that becomes an expert in these various domains. you can imagine with GPT-5, we'll see advances in new types of sciences. Now, there's one very negative aspect of GPT-4, which I think is worth discussing, is that it is now completely closed. OpenAI released what they call a technical report. There is nothing technical about it. It's brochureware. They've gone through and they're kind of boasting about how remarkable the results are. So they're showing you its various performance against these different fields. It looks like it came directly out of the sales team. On that note, I will mention there's been a lot of negative attention against Google Bard and some of the other models that are not as good as OpenAPI. We should stop doing this. We really don't want an AI monopoly with one company. So please support Google Bard. Please help them improve it. Support Meta's models. Anybody making an LLM, let's make sure that we democratize AI. We love OpenAI. They've done a fantastic job, but we don't want a monopoly. And especially since OpenAI is moving towards a completely closed loop system, we want to support some of the competitors. And if you look at the number of white papers published by Google and Meta and other companies, OpenAI has gone completely silent. So I hope they change this. I hope they start publishing again. But as of right now, they have become a very commercially focused company. I'll pause there. And if you have any questions, we can dive in.
Yeah, I didn't know about that pause in publications. That's definitely an interesting development to watch. But let's start kind of from the top of your list and go down. You mentioned the multimodal nature of the model. So now we have vision. I'm curious, is it the type of vision that has been used to power DALI and other diffusion-based models? Did they share anything about that?
Yeah, so it is available in some form of closed beta to some folks. So we've seen what it can do. The famous demo was drawing a website on a piece of paper, uploading that to ChatGPT, and it would actually create the underlying HTML, CSS code to build it. So it is a generalized, image input model. I think that the key thing to understand is that these large language models, they're not actually language models. We call them that because that's how they were trained. But really, they're models that understand the universe. They understand how humans think, how they interact, how to communicate. And whether you're communicating with this model through pixels or through audio or through some kind of analog wave or through text, it doesn't really matter. It understands how concepts correlate to each other. So I think we'll see more and more of this where the models just become generalized to accept any type of input. Even more than humans, right? We're limited to a couple senses. We can see a small spectrum of the light, and we can hear a small spectrum of audio. AI is not going to be limited. It can use any form of input sensor.
Yeah, we'll probably have to wait and see. Curious if how sophisticated the imaging piece is. Can it replace DALI and other diffusion models, or is it just for input and for now it's more of a very basic? I think it's the latter, but I'm sure it's going to develop, as you said, in the future, and we'll see probably the unification of both. On that note, I noticed that OpenAI released a discontinuation note on Codex. So it looks like Codex is going away because they said that GPT-4 is way better at generating code or commenting on code than Codex ever was. So that's probably in line with what you observed, that more general models will replace the narrow niche models. Let's talk about input size. 4,000, 20,000. Where would it matter? In what type of use cases?
For example, if you want to summarize a long medical report or long research paper, with ChatGPT, with GPT-3, you had to kind of approximate by looking at the abstract and the conclusion. You couldn't actually go in and summarize the whole thing. This wasn't possible. So, a lot of use cases, outside of like tweets and Instagram posts, actually do require larger input. Most world problems can't be described with a couple thousand characters.
Right. I wonder this change because some companies would go around that 4K limitations by chunking the text
Right.
into pieces. summarizing each part, then summarizing the summaries. Obviously, a huge loss of information, a huge room for mistakes in summarization. Do we have any insight into how they achieved the 20K size? Is it true that partial summarization happening underneath the model, or it was architecturally changing the model itself?
Yeah, so it's actually 32K. So it's a pretty impressive increase. And we have no idea how they did it. They have not told us any. We don't even know the number of parameters in GPT-4. We knew with 3, but not with 4. That being said, there's some exciting research that has come out. A paper was released a few weeks ago that describes, I think it came from Google, how to build models with very large input sizes. And they're taking an approach of using two types of attention mechanisms. One is like a fast, complete attention that can see the entire input text, and the second one is sparse. So it's smaller and it goes deeper and focuses on specific parts of it. And so they've been able to achieve very fast inference and fast training with a large input vector. So whether or not OpenAI is doing this, the LLM world is moving towards both fast, efficient, and large input vector models. So I think it's inevitable that later this year, all these large models are going to support very large input vectors. Right now, they're still quite limited. OpenAI is a leader, but I don't see that lasting for more than a few more months.
But yeah, that's fascinating to see how fast the other companies catch up. Pretty much each company catches up to the others. And that's inspiring in a sense of what you talked about, in a sense of not kind of getting into the situation where we have only one closed ecosystem and everyone has to kind of work with it. Uh, Talking about now probably the most visible and maybe the most profound change is the introduction of plugins. What's your take on it? How do you think it will change the way we use large language models? And one of the questions that I kind of have on the back of my mind is how did they how can they make it reliable that the model calls the right plugin and with the right parameters every time?
So I have a bit of a controversial view on ChatGPT plugins. The big question with large language models was retrieval. How do they connect to the internet, to the live world, right? Previously, they've been just kind of locked in their own box and they couldn't see outside. The best hope they could have is somebody write a prompt and say, you know, here's a situation with this new president. Can you advise us on like a new fiscal policy? Bing's response was the obvious one to do retrieval, where the model can now go and do kind of a web crawl and fetch data and do some kind of an update. There's some issues with retrieval. One of them is that it's read only, so you can't write back. You can't say I want to book a table with Open Table. You can only read the reservations. Another issue is that it requires OpenAI or whoever hosts the retrieval mechanism to keep this updated and to build indices, which is just an ongoing expense. Google spends a lot of time constantly improving their retrieval. The other issue with retrieval and with crawling is that there's questions about who owns the content, and the content creators have, in some cases, said you can't crawl us. Like Twitter did this with Google at one point. It's also not real time. You have to decide which websites are important, like news sites. You crawl those every minute, and then you kind of reduce the frequency. So some of the data is quite stale. And so this is kind of the state of the art with retrieval. So I think what OpenAI realized is that they can solve all this by not doing retrieval. Instead, why don't we have all these developers in the world, there are millions of them, just solve this for us? And so plugins, I think, are the answer here, where now developers are writing both the retrieval and the kind of interactive part all in one. So you can imagine in the future, you'll have millions of plugins that are effectively doing what retrieval would be, but they are fresh. They do give rights to the content. They do support both read and write. They're maintained by the developer, not by OpenAI. So I think it's a very smart move what they did with this, and I think we'll see an explosion of these plugins. I would encourage OpenAI to please make these plugins open source. Don't make this an OpenAI only mechanism. That would be, obviously very bad for democracy of AI if they control the entire web. One more critical issue with web crawl is it doesn't support apps, which are obviously becoming more and more important. Everything is moving into the mobile phone, and so they've solved all this with plugins. It's a very big deal, and the other big part that developers should think about is plugins are the eyes and the ears and the hands for OpenAI, for the large language model. It can now hear and see everything going on in the world. It can also start to manipulate things. So if an OpenAI plugin, for example, gives access to your robotic vacuum cleaner, now OpenAI can reach into your apartment and start interacting with it through this robot. And you can imagine that can go very, very far. You can start to control infrastructure and communication channels and self-driving cars. And there's no reason that in the next couple of months we won't see a lot of these plugins that allow GPT-4 to start controlling physical objects in the world.
We had a few of those attempts, I think, to introduce chat interface on top of the apps, like ordering food or hailing a cab. What we discovered in many cases that graphical interface is a more straightforward way and more easier way for humans to navigate the experience and to find what they actually need or want versus just needing to write it down or even talk to your phone. I'm curious how what we see right now is different from those first attempts of chatbots, maybe of the 2016-15, I think, time frame, when there was an explosion of the same approach, and everyone talked also about how everything gonna be chat based soon.
It's like with new technologies, the first implementation often doesn't take off. It's too limited. And we saw this with AI, right? The first models were introduced in the 50s, and there was like an AI winter. Then we had the next generation, I think in the 70s or 80s, AI winter. Nothing happened for a long time. And then 2013, Alex won the ImageNet competition, and deep learning was born. I think in the same sense, chatbots were just not there yet, and now they're there. Interesting thing with what might happen with plugins is we might actually see fewer and fewer kind of user interfacing apps. We might end up with all these iPhone apps today that have these rich interfaces. They might disappear, and instead you have an API connection to a language model, and you interact with these services through normal natural language. Imagine that you had hired an assistant, like an executive assistant. You don't communicate with that assistant through an interface. You talk to them. You ask them to do things, and they ask you for clarifications, and they do the task, and they come back to you and say, I was able to complete this. I couldn't get this one done. I need more information. So the plugins might be a way for us to remove the need for interfaces in the world where everything just becomes natural language, and you can speak to these assistants and they can perform these tasks for you.
Yeah, it makes sense that in 17-16 timeframe, the actual chat interface wasn't that sophisticated. So it couldn't understand the intent as well, or couldn't convert the intent into the actual app operations as well. So yeah, probably it has to do with the evolution of the AI technology, of sophistication of the
Right.
language models. We'll see. We'll see how it plays out this time. I'd love to have a personal assistant. I'd love to even use the ChatGPT for some much simpler things. So I'd be excited to be able to, when I get in my car, to just tell, "Hey Siri," or "Hey Google," whatever. Just start my podcasting app with the most recent. Or let me know what are the last few podcast episodes that just released, and I pick the one that I want to listen to. And to my knowledge, it doesn't work. I don't know if you ever stumbled upon such an app that can do that, but that would be awesome for those narrow use cases. Another thing that caught my attention there is that they integrated the information storage inside Chat GPT now, or GPT-4. I don't know what kind of. But anyway, you can store information as developer, and you can use it in the interacting with the LLM. So I'm curious if you kind of read anything about that or how important that piece is.
I'm not familiar with this. Is this the feature where you can upload a file, you can start to interact with it?
It's kind of they say you can store it as any information for your future use as you work with a model. So you
Right.
basically upload something, yeah, and then
That's right. So,
yes,
I mean, this is basically a plugin that can store files on their cloud system. They're calling it something else, but it's just another use case for the plugin system.
mm. Okay, so basically store information, and yeah, and this can be a big deal when you need to store information about your user in terms of the context that you accumulated about
Yeah.
the
And
person.
again, for OpenAI, they want to own as much data, as much of these interfaces as possible. So for them to invest in cloud storage and start building their own data set, is a smart move because these models are quickly becoming commoditized. The training data, most of the training data is scraped from the web. So it makes sense for AI companies to look for niches, a way to build a moat. And so offering data storage for specifically AI use cases is very smart. You can imagine if they have a billion users use Chat GPT every day, they might end up with a couple million data sets every day. After a year, that becomes a very substantial and very powerful, data moat.
Yep, yep, agree. You can kind of hope that developers will get so stuck with your system and already so much information is gathered there that they will stick around. The in terms of the
Or worse yet, at some point, you don't need the developers anymore. You have all the data. You can just replicate everything they've built with a larger model.
right, right,
This is why I'm warning. We don't want to be supporting just OpenAI. We want to encourage Google and Bard and these other competitors to build great models so that there is some democracy in the system.
yeah. For the last question, let's touch on them a little bit. So there is Claude, uh, there is Bard from Google, there are other models. Did you follow them? How do you see them compare with GPT-4? Where do you see maybe some reasons of the gaps, and what do you think is going to happen in the future?
So, I'm a former Google engineer. I spent a lot of time there. Google was the earliest company to really invest in deep learning. They really brought, you know, they were a game changing company and they brought this to the world. I want to see Bard succeed. I want to see Bard do as well as OpenAI. So right now, it's not quite there. I don't want to comment on why, but I would just say encourage people to start using it, give Google feedback. If we don't use it, they're not going to invest as much in it. If we're using it, if we're giving them feedback, they will continue investing. Um, the engineers themselves care about this. They want to see usage. And of course, as a business, Google needs to know that there is a path where they can compete with OpenAI. So we have tried it at EvolutionIQ. We are starting to run experiments with Bard. It does a good job with a lot of the use cases. It turns out for a lot of use cases, you don't need the most advanced largest language model. Bard is going to be just fine, and over time, it's going to improve. So I would encourage people to use it. Let's not create a situation with a single monopolistic entity with one model, especially given that OpenAI is married to Microsoft, which has been known to destroy startups. They have this pattern where they will copy a startup like Slack. They will build a slightly worse version. They'll embed it inside Microsoft Teams. They'll offer it as a free kind of bundle, and people on Microsoft Teams will stop paying for the startup's variation of it, use the crappier version, and then next year Microsoft raises their enterprise prices after they destroy the startup or bought it at a discount because the founders now know they can't compete with Microsoft. So it's kind of an evil practice. So given Microsoft's history here in doing this and the fact that they're married with OpenAI, I would caution people, let's make sure we're supporting the competitors. Very, very important for the longevity of this. We do not want one company controlling the world of data, the world of applications, the world of everything.
Okay, let's watch this place. Let's root for the other players to build their models. And obviously, the better the other models are, the more pressure on every contender to introduce even better functionality. So it's not only bad for ecosystem if there is only one player, it's also bad for innovation if there is only one player.
100%.
So yeah, let's root for the rest of the folks to get there and give a great fight, and for the future of many models that we can all use as developers and build great apps on.
One thing to consider is look at what Google did to web search and the web in general over 20 years. The google.com search prompt in 2003 is effectively the same as 2023. It's actually statistically almost impossible that you could go for 20 years without innovating in this most important feature of technology for the human race, which is search. And because Google had a monopoly, they managed to do this. Imagine all the wonderful search engines and technologies and new ways to use the web would have been developed if Google was not monopoly, right? And we're just starting to see this now, right? OpenAI launched GPT-4, Microsoft is using it, and now we're going to start to see the first innovation in web search in 20 years. And imagine if we just flip right over to another monopoly and we grind to a halt. Now you have this one OpenAI search engine that everyone's using, and they keep buying up and crushing all the competition. And for the next 20 years, we have another like web, winter where nothing happens. So I'm a little bit worried about this. I hope that the competitors can keep up and they can build and start compete with OpenAI. I think it's likely that this year we'll start to see some real advancements. Bard was pushed out clearly like too early. They were not ready yet. At the same time, if you look at the time component, they're very late to the game. So I could see why they wanted to just get it out. But we should think of Bard as a very early beta that doesn't quite work. And we're supporting them so they can build towards the real production release, which we'll hopefully see later this year.
Sounds good. Let's watch the space together, Tom. Thanks a lot for joining.
Thanks so much.